Welcome, everybody, to this introduction with the great Athena Aktipis. I've just finished reading your book, A Field Guide to the Apocalypse, a mostly serious guide to surviving our wild times. I felt it was very serious. There are some incredible drawings of you that are completely unexpected and so fun, and I just love them. Look at this, dear audience. But I feel it's more like trying to lighten up the mood a little bit, right? Because the mood is pretty serious. You're a psychologist and you research human cooperation. And one of the great theses of this book is that we might be better equipped actually for surviving an apocalypse. We have been forged as mankind a little bit through these disasters and through the many things that we had to figure out how to do in those really, really stressful times. But there are, of course, some things that you also believe humans have to take care of individually, and that we can't really just rely on the community to solve this problem for us. So I'm so glad that you're joining us. This is a salon, so I will be asking a couple of questions, and so will the other participants. First of all, how did you end up as a psychologist writing about the apocalypse? I have a couple of psychologist friends, and this is not what they do. So what happened?
That's a great question. Really, it all came out of the sort of confluence of my studying cooperation and then starting to use zombies and the zombie apocalypse as a tool for science communication. So I started doing that like 6, 7 years ago. And at some point, I realized, well, everything was sort of going on with COVID, and I was, like probably some people here in this room, like as things were starting to unfold, I was like, oh, like this is real. This is like, a situation that we need to like get ready for. And I just kind of went into, apocalypse mode. And so I kind of like got ahead of it in a way. Like, I was sort of like 2 weeks further than most people. And that actually made it, I think, a lot easier for me to navigate all of the challenges because I was like very ready to accept reality as soon as it was like clear that there was an issue. And I think there were a lot of people who weren't as much. There was sort of that like experience with the apocalypse. And then I realized, all of the work that I'd been doing looking at cooperation and how people cooperate in times of need in small scale societies with the Human Generosity Project. So, have this like big project where we look, both with field work and experiments with human participants and computational modeling at how people are helping each other in times of need. Realize, oh, actually, like I have the expertise to really talk about how we survive apocalypses and how important, interactions with other humans are, how important our ability to sort of adapt to change, process information from our environments, share information, and sort of simulate future worlds and prepare ourselves, and these are all really cool things that we as humans can do. They're part of our, cognition, they're part of our social behavior. Some things like, how curious are you? How are interested are you in like engaging with the world, our sort of personality factors. And so I was like, well, this is turns out like I have a unique set of skills to be applied to this moment. So that's really what this book came out of.
I love it so much. You're talking about how just sometimes being 2 weeks ahead of other people in a situation that is just so shocking that you have a kind of a cognitive dissonance. We know this even from like crimes committed against individuals. Like if you kind of cop to the fact that you are being like mugged in the street fast and you are able to believe it, you will react much faster. Right. And we
Absolutely.
basically train people, first responders, we train the military basically to automatically like skip the kind of reality distortion part of the thinking and go into like, yes, they are shooting at you.
Yeah,
Like, don't think about it.
that's right.
So when you felt that you were 2 weeks ahead of other people, what were the common excuses that you heard from other people for not dealing with the situation?
I think a lot of people just thought that it was a passing thing, right? So I think that many times people don't deal with a changing reality because the costs of switching are high, like switching your mental models of the future, switching your behaviors, that is costly. So, it makes sense on some level to have some resistance to accepting that reality has changed if there's some uncertainty, right? But I think the question is, how much of a signal do you need that things have really changed in a huge way in order to switch over? And I think I've always just been more ready to change, more ready to do things differently, more ready to move on from, my previous conceptions than a lot of people. And that, I think even if it's not conscious for people, it is that cost of switching your whole mindset that it plays a big role. And I think also people differ a lot in their ability to hold multiple potential representations of the future in their head at the same time, right? And so, when you're thinking of the future, are you like, okay, this is kind of what I think is going to be the future, and maybe there's some like small probability cloud around that, and you're like, but this is sort of the general direction. Or when you're thinking about the future, are you like, well, it could go this way, or maybe it could go this way, and also possibly this way, and you have like a probability cloud maybe that is not just or normally distributed around what you think the future is, but you're actually considering multiple potential scenarios for the future. And then, being able to say, well, I'm going to actually spend some of my energy on maybe this thing that doesn't have a super high likelihood of happening, but if it does happen, it would be really serious. Or, and I think if you're already ready to do that, then that makes it easier to switch when you need to because you've already started investing in an alternative pathway. So you're not just like, oh, it's all of the costs of leaving the path that I'm on, the sort of simulation of the future that I've been doing all this time. You can, have multiple ones that are sort of active at various moments.
Yeah, I uh I'm very, very curious, and we'll talk about this a little in a little bit. Like the different personality types responding to different things differently, how much your environment and upbringing might also matter here, but also that there are certain characteristics that are brought out in everybody or almost everybody, regardless of your personality type, under certain circumstances. I was also, I mean, during COVID, I was definitely a little bit ahead. I was not as far ahead as like A16Z famously, in 2019 December, no longer shaking hands because they had heard that this thing was coming. But I do remember I kind of a conflict with a close friend of mine. We were in Brussels. And I think she was taking her kids to the playground, and I was jogging, and I was like, I'm going to do a round so that we can meet up. And the I had already had COVID by then for the first time, and the big New York Times expose had just been published from the Queen's Hospital, et cetera, et cetera. And I remember telling my friend, like, okay, so what are we going to do? And she was like, what do you mean? Like, no, no, this is going to pass and we will get, there will be a vaccine tomorrow. This is like 2020. And I was like, no, we will be under lockdown for 2 years.
Yeah.
Do you not understand? Like when I say, what are we
Hmm.
going to do is like, what are we going to do when we have already understood this and rearranged our lives? And there was this wall, and these are like, my friend group in Brussels are hyper educated policy people working for the EU, like they are in health education, like this is like they are not strangers to data, but like it's so inconceivable
Yeah.
that it's little weird nomadic people like me and you, the weirdos who are like, we need to like rethink everything
Yeah.
because what we thought we would be doing the next 2 years, that's not what's going to happen. Like, forget. Next, don't
Absolutely.
even waste time of like
Yeah.
mourning over the spilled milk. Like, let's move on.
Yeah, my best friend was visiting me in Flagstaff right before the pandemic was declared, and she was on her way with her husband and her little dog, and we're like coordinating about stuff, and I'm like, okay, I'm like doing a lot of things to like get ready because of, the pandemic coming. And she's like, what are you talking about? And then, like she came and she stayed with me for a few days and we like went to a bar and I was like, this is probably the last time we're going to be in a bar. And she's like, what? I mean, she's like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, make sure, on your drive back home to Colorado, you stop at the grocery store on the way home because once you get to Denver, you're probably not going to be able to get supplies. And she was like, yeah, okay, we'll do that. They didn't do that. And then they like ended up getting back to Denver and everything was closed. And now, she's like, yeah, I should have
Yeah.
listened to you, Athena.
And then when the kind of ball drops for your friends, you have to be
Yeah,
extremely gracious.
exactly.
You
Yeah.
can't be like, finally, you have to be like, I know it's hard. Shh.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
you can't be a know-it-all in that moment. Any questions at this point from the audience? I just want to stop for a second before I dive into some more granular stuff. Lilia is here, who I know is a Lilia would survive an apocalypse. She would be fine.
I don't know. If I do, only because I'm a Libra and I can get along with everyone.
You'll be like uniting the cannibals with the zombies and be like, let's be friends.
So what versions of apocalypse should we be prepared for? What versions of apocalypse should we have in our mental models so that we can easily switch between them?
Yeah, well, I think one of the big ones is pandemic. And thankfully, we had an experience with what honestly is, like, historically speaking, not a really bad pandemic. I mean, it changed everything, but like, the fatality rate wasn't super high compared to previous pandemics. It really wasn't
Better than
horrible.
the Spanish flu, right? Because at least it
Exactly, yeah.
killed the children.
Yeah, but even if we just look at the flu, the chances in our lifetimes that there'll be a mutation that would be, much worse than COVID is about 50%. And that's just the flu mutating, right? There's so many other possibilities. So I think, pandemic is definitely something that, think about in my life is like, okay, what's the plan if we catch wind that there is another pandemic? And, when there are sort of, epidemics that rise up, like I go into a little bit more of an alert mode of like, okay, what would the plan be? Where are my kids? Who's where? Like, is there any big travel that's planned, that maybe I should reconsider? So, I definitely kind of do go more into alert mode then. Um, Natural disasters like, wildfires, and then you get all of these sort of like knock-on effects, right? So say you have like a fire and then that leads to like greater risk of like mudslides and then, and then you have more risk of flooding, right? So these things sort of compound. So depending on what region you live in, there are going to be some sort of unique risks from natural disasters combined with sort of, then how they have these reverberating effects and sometimes also interact with, human systems and infrastructure like roads and such. So I think, those are the ones that I think of about the most. But, even something like a massive solar flare, like, that could, really impact our ability to communicate with each other. It could take a while for us to recover from that if it happened in a way that, we weren't able to sort of prepare quickly enough or people didn't take it seriously. Like if there's a warning about it, to respond and sort of, shut down everything that needs to be shut down to minimize damage. So yeah, those are some examples. I mean, there's also obviously, like nuclear event, that constant issue of, how do we globally, regulate that. In fact, just yesterday I got a text from my brother. He's a diplomat and he works on nuclear anti-proliferation with the UN and he just helped to pass some uh important resolutions around that, but it's a constant issue I think that we need to be aware of, and more generally, war and conflict, it's been apocalyptic for humans since our earliest beginnings, having conflict with other groups. So
I mean, as we are sitting here, some of our developers at Intersect are in Ukraine. And since the election flare-up, some of them didn't have electricity for a couple of days. And so it's not a very abstract thing. And I love in your book that, you talk about the kind of high-level psychology, and then there is an actual like diagram of what to put into your car. What do you when you have a young child? And I'm kind of bewildered by this realization that I never really kind of like achieved before, which is that humans are very resilient as a group. Like we've seen through disasters, war, that a group is pretty inventive in coping with things, right?
mm-hmm.
Even if you have a group of relatively young people where nobody remembers the, I don't know, Second World War or like Cold War drills, they will kind of figure out how to like make a makeshift hospital tent, how to continue the educating of the children, how to get fresh water. Like we have to, but individuals are not. And I remember during the pandemic, everybody had an apocalypse box. And I was in Brussels, right? So whilst Californians were like stocking up on water bottles, the Belgian supermarket, they kind of like raided the cheese counter. Like it makes no sense. Like, I'm serious. Like all the show-made cheese was gone, and it's really smelly, even if you only have like one slice in your house. So I don't know how those houses smelled. Anyway, and I was like, I remember thinking kind of, I was like, okay, like first principles, like what do I need to have in the house if all the shops close? And then you're like, oh, well, things that I can't make at home, right? Like batteries and Tampax and light bulbs. Like it's not the cheese. Like, and I don't know. It was just interesting to think how, like I had a fire once in my life in London where the apartment twice removed from mine completely burned out and we had to flee. And that, I think there you have the instinct, like you're taking your laptops and a coat and your passport, right? And you're waiting in outside. But for like a longer term, we don't. And I love about your book where you're like, this is acquirable knowledge. Like we can actually explain to people. And it's not an instinct. It's a little bit like you have a baby and people are like, oh, she will know what to do. No, she has to learn. If she like, she has an instinct level, of course, like it's built in. But the rest is science. You have to learn to do it. Is there something for you where you think we're under or overestimating the instinctive reaction of people? And you're like, this needs to be taught.
Yeah, so I think that in terms of, actually just having basic supplies in our house in case of power outage and, water going out, things like that. I think we're like because we live in a world where it's pretty rare to have your water go out or your power go out for very long. I mean, here now in Phoenix, it's not unusual to have your power go out for a while. So that's happening more and more. But if it's not something that you even have sort of small scale challenges to deal with, then our brains are like, oh, that's something I don't need to worry about. So I think we have to be very proactive
Until you do, right? It's always until you do.
Exactly. And that's why, so like people always ask me, how do you define an apocalypse? And I like the ancient Greek definition, which is like a revelation. So it's like a revelation of the underlying risk, the underlying reality of the world. And so if you have small challenges with your power going out for the day, or maybe there's an issue with your water, then that's a small apocalypse that reveals that there is an underlying risk that that thing might not always be there. And that is golden opportunity to learn so that you can be more prepared for when a larger event happens. So that's what I like to think about, in terms of really embracing when things go wrong, because that's an opportunity to learn, to develop more skills, and to really sort of encode the knowledge that, okay, this is a risk that I face in my world.
Thank you so much, Dina. And I think, Laura, you had a comment. Do you want to jump in and share your notes? Or should we read it out? What do you feel like? I think you're muted. Are you muted?
Yeah, we can't hear you.
I'm just going to ask a question quickly, and when Laura is back, we will go to her. So to go back to I love the revelation concept, and one of the things that we reveal the most in a crisis moment is our personality, right? Who we are really, and whoever we could be. How do you? I mean, for those, I don't know how many people finished the book, but like, how would you summarize your findings when it comes to the big five of the apocalypse or the MBTI of the apocalypse? And is there a moment when facing this shared challenge, we kind of transcend these differences?
Yeah. So, before I was sort of talking about the ways that we're not instinctively prepared, but the ways that we are instinctively prepared is that when shit goes wrong, like we get in there to help each other, regardless of, who you are, where you're from, what your political beliefs are. Like people just help each other because they see that there's a need and that they have the ability to help. And that's something that we've seen across societies with the Human Generosity Project. It's something we see over and over again, even in modern Western contexts when there are disasters. And yes, when things go wrong with that, it gets a huge amount of media coverage, but by and large, the rule is you just see an unbelievable amount of generosity and helping when the shit hits the fan. So I think that's one way that we're extremely well prepared, actually, for dealing with disasters, is that we have these instincts to help each other. And the more that we do to build community before we go into a disaster, the easier it is to really accelerate that and to get those benefits of cooperation. Even if you don't have it going in, though, people quickly jump in to help and start to develop trust and community. But one of the things that's really valuable about having that community ahead of time is that you know who has what skills, who has what vulnerabilities, who has what knowledge, and that can be really valuable for being able to respond quickly, to adapt as things are changing, and to create a network that can help you be flexible and adaptable in the face of those challenges. So yeah, that I'd say the two big things are like, cooperation and community, and then kind of having a sense of adventure and like being ready to, go out there and really see like, okay, this is what the world has to offer. And if things go wrong, not freaking out about it, but really taking it as an opportunity to learn. It's for me, it's changed a lot for like how I approach traveling. Like, whether I'm road tripping or on, going on airplanes, like things go wrong all the time. And if you're like, oh my God, something's going wrong again, this is horrible, it's very different than if you're like, oh, this thing is going wrong. What do I have like already in my like risk management to deal with this? It's like, do I have my snacks? Do I have my change of clothes? Do I have, things to stay warm? And then you sort of practice your apocalypse skills like when your flight is canceled, right? And it makes it just, much easier to kind of go with the flow when you're like, oh, part of this dealing with these minor disasters in my life is actually building my resilience for dealing with larger things that might happen. So that's kind of why I talk about this as like a lifestyle and mindset shift as much as it is like, being ready for disasters that might come.
It's a little bit like a state of readiness, like a samurai. You're not always fighting, but anybody can attack you at any point. I really
Yeah,
love.
or maybe for a slightly more fun analogy, like if you look at the way that really good improvisational comedy works.
Mm.
So you probably heard about yes and. Well, another way of framing yes and is that you always accept reality. So somebody's starting to put together a scene and you accept that reality. You do it fast, and then you jump in and you work with that. And I think that that's a, perfect description of what we need to do as our world is changing, to accept the reality and then work with that to move forward.
I love that point, especially because it's an example of how, like, practicing improv comedy can literally help us build cooperation skills and
Yeah.
be more disaster ready.
Yeah.
Like, I just think that's very beautiful because I think that, like, a lot of artistic practices are overlooked in
Yeah.
terms of like their practical value to society. And
Yeah.
I would love if more people respected the practice of improv comedy because I feel like it not only has individual benefits in terms of like creative thinking and like improv is a skill that everyone uses day to day, like when they're having conversations and like interacting with other people in the world. But yeah, that just really resonates with me.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, I've had the most fun also like doing, so for the book tour I've had, it's been a very unconventional book tour. I've, done a lot of music events. I've done a variety show where we're like pulling many different things together, including comedy. And then we also worked with the IO Theater in Chicago, which is like the longest running improv theater, and did two events there for the tour as well. And I had so much fun working with the improv comedians there. And it turns out we have a lot in common about, how we approach things. So hoping that we'll do more. They had a great time with us too. So we kind of have an open invitation to go back there and do more, which I'm looking forward to. So
I love this so much. I think travel is also a very, very good analogy in general. I travel a lot. I always say it's during travel, it's like a wedding. All the little things will go wrong, but the big thing doesn't usually. And the little thing's fine. Like, oh,
yeah,
there's a delay, whatever. It's fine. Nobody cares.
totally. Yeah.
I want to kind of go back to the character reveal part of this whole thinking and talk a little bit about incentives. So, of course, we have this built-in beautiful instinct of altruism. George Price famously even proved this mathematically, the hereditary nature of our altruism. And but how should we approach the kind of incentives layer here? Like, how can we ensure that the better angels come out of people in a situation where, I mean, I can imagine in an apocalyptic situation, and we see this in disaster times, there is some looting, there are some free riders, there are people whose primary kind of instinct would be to kind of use the opportunity to get something done that they couldn't in a normal society.
Yeah.
How for the people who won the cooperation, what can we do, and what are the good ways of ensuring that more people are cooperative?
Yeah. Well, like I said before, most people, their instinct is to be very cooperative. So, but the fact is, even just a few exploiters can ruin it for everyone, right? So it's like we do have to pay attention to that and be ready for that. So there are a couple of things that we can do. One is to sort of be ready to walk away from a group, from a partner when you're like, this isn't right. So, and actually, this was what I did for my dissertation work. This model of cooperation, sort of based on game theory and the prisoner's dilemma, where you always cooperate, but you leave if your partner defects or your group is insufficiently cooperative. And it turns out that helps protect individuals from being exploited, and it also changes the dynamics of the entire population. So, if you imagine we got all these groups, right? And there's varying levels of cooperation. People are, or agents, and the model case are staying or leaving based on how cooperative the groups are. What ends up happening is that the groups that are composed of mostly cooperators are more stable. than the groups that are composed of mostly defectors. So very quickly you have a situation where you have this differential stability, and you have defectors being more likely to be moving because their groups are breaking up. And the groups of cooperators, because they're cooperating, they're generating more benefits for everyone. And this leads cooperators to have higher payoffs in the overall population, even though within any specific group, they can have lower payoffs than the exploiters. So this ability to conditionally leave when you're interacting with exploiters is powerful, not just for self-protection, but also for changing the landscape, so that cheaters and exploiters aren't favored overall, which I think is pretty damn cool that it works on both levels. So that's one thing, is just, walk away from exploiters, toxic people, whatever you want to call it, right? Just get out of there. Not just for you, but for everyone, right? Because if they're getting an advantage from exploiting you, then that's helping them to potentially exploit more people in the future. So walk away when you need to. Then there's this area sort of that's kind of a sub part of game theory that's also sort of in psychology called commitment theory. And there are some really cool concepts in there, like, when you start having an interaction with a new person, you start with sort of low stakes. The way I look at it in practical terms is you can be very, generous and helpful about small initial things. You don't have to have a lot of, sort of worry about, oh, am I going to just do some small nice thing for someone, or be intellectually generous with like sharing some help or ideas on a project. Like, those small things, go for it. But then when you ratchet up, right? So then it's like, okay, that small thing went well. So then I'm ready to do a little more. And then if that went well, then I'm ready to do a little more. Now, there is one caveat here, though, which is that um, sometimes con artists, they will do this sort of ratcheting up, but usually what they're doing is they're ratcheting up, just asking you for more and more and more, and they may be providing some, sort of emotional energy. They may be like love bombing in the case of romance cons, those kinds of things. But you have to sort of really look at like, well, is this ratcheting up something that is truly mutual, where I'm benefiting, and not let yourself get ratcheted up without seeing that they're also ratcheting up their commitment in a practical way. So I would say, kind of starting with those two things, like get out of there when you're like, this isn't good, and then, ratcheting up commitment and investment in a way that where eyes wide open, again, accept reality, right? So that's the thing, with cons, and also oftentimes with exploiters in groups, is that people will, not face the reality of the fact that they're being exploited. So I think, it's really important to have that. And then, there's also just the issue of like, well, what do you do if somebody is exploiting or cheating or harming within the group, but you don't want to just, leave, or you don't want to, kick them out? Well, a lot of societies around the world have these very developed practices of restorative justice, where the goal really is like, how do we bring you back into the fold, help you make the wrongs right, that make sure that the harm that you inflicted, you're showing that you genuinely are wanting to make that better. And I think that's a really, it's a very powerful, very effective mechanism that we as humans have been using for a long time. It does take a bunch of time and energy, right? Like people, like the whole communities come together. There's a lot of talking, there's a lot of energy and attention on it, but it does lead to positive outcomes, and really being able to reintegrate people sometimes who have done wrong. But, There is also just the fact that some people are just inherently assholes, and there's no way that you can, get them to like really genuinely care about how they're affecting other people.
But
So,
boy, do we
you have to,
try, right? We
yeah,
try and
so
try and yeah.
you try, but then walk away if you need to. So,
I had a whole trip at the beginning of this year when I became completely obsessed with the idea of like reciprocity tests and the
mm,
fact that so many relations it kind of I think I started kind of going down that rabbit hole because I'm European. I had spent a lot of time in America, but this is the first time when I really live here, like in an ongoing way. And I always felt that there was a very big similarity between Eastern European culture of like favor-based culture and America also has a favor-based culture.
mm,
Western Europe, no. Like
hmm,
Western Europe is a favor based in a very different way. Like it's favor based in the sense that you had to have gone to Oxford together, and then you can ask something.
hmm,
But it's like, but in Eastern Europe, you trade favors, right?
hmm,
And so you build out every individual kind of builds out for themselves a kind of professional network where they can feel really safe because it's mutual and they don't have to build from zero every relationship when they pick up the phone, right? It's a really good way of optimizing and like reducing the cost and reducing the time. And then I started picking up on different, like actual differences with the American version of this. And so I became very, very interested in this whole idea of like untested reciprocity
hmm,
and how many relationships are based on the idea that one day I can also go to you if I have a problem, but it's kind of like Schrodinger's cat. Like until you ask for it, you are both accepted and denied.
hmm,
And most of these are never tested
hmm,
until you actually have a problem.
hmm.
And then you have the revelation, right? And so to me, that's just an absolutely fascinating question of like how deeply actually society benefits from not testing these.
Hmm. Yeah, well, that ties into a bunch of interesting sort of topics and issues. So one is just this idea that, what you really need for cooperation and helping to be easy is a feeling of interdependence, and that your fates are really tied to each other, because then that just creates an incentive for everyone to help, right? So that's super important. And then another thing which I talk about, some in the book, but also, a lot more just with the work that I've done on the Human Generosity Project, is that we see that there are these two distinct modes that people go into. And we've seen this across many of the societies that we've studied with the Human Generosity Project. So for example, with the Maasai, where we started the project, they have uh, this cultural norm called osotwa. It means umbilical cord, and it's basically that, I will help you if I can help you without going below what I need, and if you're genuinely in need. So there's basically two rules to osotwa. You only ask for help if you're genuinely in need, and then you give if you're asked and able, right, to somebody who's within your osotwa network. So they have this osotwa system. Now that is for things that are unpredictable and uncontrollable. So apocalypse-like things, a drought, disease, their, cows were stolen, right? Like those kinds of things. But they also have a system called Sile. And Sile is actually an account keeping system. It's like a debt and credit system. So, say I wanted to like throw a big party to celebrate my son getting married, but I needed a cow for that. And I asked Anna, to have a cow to throw this party. Anna would know that I would pay her
I
back.
would totally give you a cow. I would give you an intellect cow.
But because that's like something that's not necessary, right? And it's also something predictable and controllable. It would fall in this different domain. And we saw the same thing also with ranchers in southern Arizona. So they have a system called neighboring, where they help each other if there's, if they have to fix fences, if they have to take their cows to market, if somebody gets injured, if there are, unexpected problems that happen, they come in and help each other. And what we saw though is we asked people about what's the unpredictability of all of these kinds of needs that might arise. that you might do neighboring for, injury, equipment failure, branding, taking cows to market, etc. And then we asked, how likely would you expect to get paid back for this? And what we found was, as you might expect, the more unpredictable and uncontrollable those needs are, the less people expected to get paid back. So we seem to switch into this mode of almost acting as informal insurance for each other when we are in that kind of situation where there is a sort of unexpected and uncontrollable need.
I love this, and I would love to hear from the audience, but I'm pretty sure that if somebody asked you to like go and get a package for them at the, at the post office or something, you would be like, well, you knew it was coming, I'm at work, la la la. But if someone was like, my house is on fire, you would drop whatever you're doing and go there, right? And you would never, like, you're not even thinking about being paid back, because it's just, for me, I always say, like, there are things in life we do because we would not be able to live with ourselves not having done it. Like, you can turn it down, but then what do you do the next day when you wake up and have to look into the mirror? Like, you will stop feeling like a person, basically, because we have this human duty to each other to keep each other alive and healthy and safe. Laura, what's happening with your mic? Do you think you can ask the question now?
Yeah,
now I can hear you. Hi.
Yeah, I don't know.
A lot of water under sea level, very floodable. So it's a good
Yeah,
place
no,
to share
we know
apocalyptic thoughts from.
in the Netherlands we have a pretty good idea about how to manage risk, but no, I don't know. I wanted to say a little bit. I am very much not in a good state right now, but I am happy to be here because this is distraction for me. But it always happens to be the case that I am in a inter-intellect session when I am going through a personal crisis, which says a lot about this topic because I think I'm always going through personal crises, and for apocalypse, that's actually kind of good because I have severe anxiety and just a whole host of issues. And like when I go to like a train station, I'm like looking around for like where's the exit? What if that guy has a gun? Like what if I push that guy onto the
Another
train
person
tracks?
who would survive an apocalypse. There you go.
Yeah, it's and yeah, anxiety is a very good trait for surviving the apocalypse. If that's some advice I would like to give. But no, what I
It
wanted to
is, unless
say,
it's paralyzing.
yeah, that's very bad.
Yeah.
I really
Yeah.
liked Lars von Trier's movie. I don't like Lars von Trier generally.
Oh,
There was like a very interesting thing in Melancholia where they have
yeah,
sisters dealing, and that's a kind of apocalypse that is inevitable, right? Like very early in the movie, we learn that this I don't know, it's a meteor or something that will crash into the earth. And
yeah,
you have the older sister played by Charlotte Gainsbourg, who is a neurotic, right? She's like a normal woman, basically dealing with the grief and the horror of this whole situation, like most people would. Goes through the different stages of denial and grief and panic and whatever. And then you have the other character played by Kirsten Dunst, who is clinically depressive, right? Depressed. She's very depressed. Like she's almost catatonic throughout the movie. And at the beginning, it's bad because she's not prepping at all. For her, the world has already ended long ago, and this is just the the show part. But then it becomes an asset in a weird way because she really doesn't care, and then the characters start relying on her. And it's obviously it's an absurd, and with Lars von Trier, you never really know if he's just like fucking with you.
What's this movie? I haven't seen this one.
Melancholia.
Melancholia.
I
That sounds
apologize
great.
in advance, okay? I'm only recommending this for like professional reasons. I really dislike Lars von Trier. I think he gets women wrong on a very fundamental level, and I'm like not interested in his opinion at all. But in like this one thing is really, really beautifully. I mean, we have knowledge from everywhere, like journals surviving shipwrecks. We have a lot of literature from the American Civil War, from the Holocaust, from the Gulag, right? Like how different personalities dealt with a situation where keeping your shit together is extremely costly, and the incentive to cheat is relatively high. So also trusting is costly or risky, and the survival rate is low. And who are the people who will still put in that enormous work, right? Even if the survival rate is low. And then those people make it out, right? And what are the moments? I mean, in Imre Kertész, I'm Hungarian, and there's one Hungarian literary Nobel laureate, Imre Kertész, who wrote a book called Fatelessness about his time in Auschwitz when he was 14. It's one of the most beautiful texts ever written. And there is this moment in it when they are like waiting between two of these horrible trains where many people die on the train, and it's horrible. And he's starving and he's completely emaciated, like near death, a 14-year-old. And everybody is, right? So how can you help each other? Like everybody's on the verge of death. And this old rabbi gives him his soup and just puts down his, I think he's on a stretcher, like he can no longer even move. And, you know, you're reading this book written in 1967 when Kertész was a middle-aged man, and he lived because of that. And like, what is the moment when you put aside your own survival instincts and say, if I have to die, I'm old, but like he has a better chance.
This is exactly what's called the Philip Sidney game in game theory, which is you know, the way the story goes is you know, Sir Philip Sidney saw that there, you know, was a soldier that needed the water more than he did, and gave it to him. And you know, and the idea with this game is like, you don't know if you will be the lucky one or the unlucky one. And so if everybody just has the rule to give if they are the lucky one and they see that someone else is the unlucky one, then that benefits everyone in the end.
I love it. Any other questions in the audience? Hi, Kaylee. Hi, Miss Solo. I know Miss Solo is not alone.
Yeah, no, wait.
She was going to just listen. If any notes come in, bring them on before we move on to the next. And hi, Sean.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Hi.
Okay, cool. Yeah, there was a little lag for a second. Yeah, I mean, what all of this is making me think of is, you know how people say that New Yorkers are not nice, but they're kind?
That's so true. Lilia, is that
And
true? She's like, yeah.
yeah, but like I've been having this experience where a friend of mine just moved there, and she's from the South, and so I think the thing that I'm hearing when she's complaining about the way people talk about having relationships is that it can be kind of like phony or canned, and like people don't really mean it. But I also think of all of the times that like I was in the city and something was happening and somebody would pop out of nowhere and help me.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like New York is interesting in this way where it kind of happens that because anything can come out of any corner, people who have lived there for a long time without thinking end up being really kind. And so I think it's an interesting sort of city to think about the end of the world. um, because of, yeah, like anything can happen. And so people kind of don't think twice about being helpful. I don't know what to do with that, but I think I was listening to what you were saying, Laura, and I was like where where does this happen? And in places that aren't like Kenya or Arizona, where people have names for it. In New York, it's just like what people do.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, an equivalent would be a workplace, right? Like I was an athlete. We had the best team. And what I noticed in my life was like when I had a very breezy job, like, I don't know, I was for a brief time an intern at an advertising agency, and people were kind of just like at this work to show that they have this job. versus like having a real job when you're like building something and it's hard, like that really forges a community because you have to cooperate. And maybe this is the same with cities. Like if you live in a beautiful California suburb, where you don't even have to interact with your neighbor at all, versus in New York, or I mean, there's no way not to interact with people in New York. Like that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
But did you do any research into that, Athena? Like the hardship and or challenge versus like communality and how that relates to each other?
Yeah, we actually found some really interesting things with helping behavior during COVID. So we have a longitudinal study. We started it right before the pandemic began. This is like part of my like being 2 weeks ahead. I was like, let's get a longitudinal cohort like going. So we actually have this data. We started collecting it right before the pandemic began, and we were able to look at how people's reports of helping each other during, over the course of months. And I think even some of the people who we have in the data set, it was, up to a year or 18 months, how that affected them. And we found actually that the act of engaging in help seemed to shift people's dispositional empathy and, sort of regard for others up. So the act of actually being called on and then helping seems to change people's empathy in the medium term, which is pretty cool.
And that kind of goes to show how much I mean, we're lazy little mammals, but we also love to help. Like we love to feel
Yeah.
needed. And I think there is like a threshold when something stops being an annoying chore, when you think somebody else can be also cold
Yeah.
versus like, oh, I can contribute here.
Yep,
I
absolutely.
love that. If there are no other questions about the personality types and these different characteristics and the beautiful game theory underneath it all, I would love to talk a little bit about the many inventions that come out of disasters, right? I always say that every time I see a roundabout, I know that people had died there. Like nobody builds a roundabout without first having to suffer decades of traffic accidents. And it's terrible, right? You're always in a disaster site whenever you are in a roundabout anywhere in the world. But you look at the UN, you look at the nuclear pact, you look at NHS famously. One of my favorite papers ever written is about how in early 1500s Germany, the middle class basically arose because there was a wave of plagues. And because of the plagues, the middle class started pressuring the sovereign to have hospitals built and orphanages and schools. And by the time the plague had subsided, these institutions were in place, and that was good, right? Like you want more democracy usually and not less. So do you want to speak a little bit to how what gets activated in people when there is this collective danger? And what are the weird positive things throughout our history that you have found that we gained from these terrible instances?
Yeah, well, in general, having challenges, having sort of new problems that we have to deal with, it both gets us sort of thinking as individuals, and it puts us into a mindset where, the benefits of working together, of sharing information in order to solve those problems, often will outweigh whatever sort of, status or resource benefits people might see at the individual level. And so, whether it's natural disaster or a war or anticipating some potential even massive opportunity that you can't capitalize on without working together. Our ability as humans to sort of do what maybe is the most interesting and unique thing about humans, which is we can sort of take all of this propositional information, theoretical frameworks, like all of this very abstract stuff, and then transfer it among ourselves, and then coordinate and cooperate in order to, build giant buildings or, create a rocket that can go into space. Like, those are things that you can't do as an individual. They require the sort of ability to work together, to share information, and yeah, necessity is the mother of all invention, absolutely. And, it's necessity is not necessarily a warm mother, right? But it does move invention along, right? And people realize like you have to work together, share information. It can also move forward things that we might not be as excited about, right? Especially when it comes to sort of war and conflict, right? I mean, I'm sure many people have seen Oppenheimer and sort of know of the sort of like nuclear history, right? Like, yeah, there's a lot of sort of complex game theoretical issues there with, deterrence and et cetera. But, the fact is if you have multiple parties that all have an incentive to compete with each other and they're cooperating in order to compete with each other, that can raise the stakes in a way that ultimately is bad for everybody. So it's complicated, but I think that, in general, if we can, sort of embrace, when we do have challenges, accept that reality, and then sort of work together to deal with those challenges, that oftentimes that can result in really interesting and cool and novel things that we do collectively.
Yeah, the arms race. I'm in the Annie Jacobson book. If somebody hasn't read it yet and you want to give yourself a very tough week, now is the time to use the Christmas break to read Nuclear War, a scenario. Lilia, you have your hand up.
Okay, so one of the things that I was thinking about listening to the conversation is that we've identified that like humans do have this altruistic instinct in which they want to help each other, and it gets triggered in situations that are like out of the ordinary, for example, and it seems to naturally come out then. But I'm wondering, like, what are things that we can do to actively cultivate that instinct in other people? Like, are
Mhm.
there ways that we can engineer society or like culture better in order to like create more favorable conditions? Because so one of the things, like, I hear this argument a lot in favor of capitalism, where people are like, well, humans are naturally super selfish. Thus, it makes the most sense to like have designed an economy around that fact. But I think that sometimes it like ignores the fact that humans have a wide range of instincts. And one of the things that I'm wondering is like, how can we like create a structure for our society that like makes it more like creates more favorable outcomes for people who are acting on the instincts that we want to encourage.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I have some thoughts, a lot of thoughts on this. So one thing that I think is really important is number one to sort of recognize that we have these two different modes, right? There's a sort of more account keeping mode, and there's this more need-based helping mode, and they're activated by different environments, right? So when things are fairly stable, probably also when people are more sort of focused on resources, status competition, that kind of thing, people are more on this account keeping mode. But when, the existential risk is salient, then people go more into this need-based helping mode. Now, what we've seen in the societies that we've studied with the Human Generosity Project is actually that you have this similar kind of structure for risk pooling that happens across all of these societies. And essentially what's going on is people are managing their own individual risk to the extent that they can. But then when these unexpected events happen, they will call on help in their network. And the way that this works is it's a limited risk pooling system, right? Because you're not pooling the risk of everything with everyone. What you're doing is you're pooling the risk of going below a certain threshold. And that means that you're also protecting yourself, because if you won't give under that threshold. So this is a way of kind of balancing both taking care of yourself, right? And in these models and these, not even models, these actual systems that people are using, individuals have their own resources. They're not putting all the resources into a common pool. They're maintaining their own resources. They're taking care of their own resources. But then in these certain circumstances, they are helping in this sort of very generous kind of way. So I think that a structure like that is quite viable and can potentially help to replace even some of the things that are going wrong with a lot of market-based insurance. So I talked briefly about this at Hereticon. Actually, I sort of, gave a heretical framing on it that we should just ditch all market insurance and use informal insurance, which, I mean, there's probably some things that market insurance is still good for, but when it comes to like actually dealing with like very apocalyptic things, like where there's a lot of uncertainty, uncontrollability, etc., market insurance isn't good at doing those things, right? And so for those kinds of things, I think we need new models. So I'm actually very sort of optimistic about the possibility that we could rethink some aspects of insurance, maybe when it comes to risks that we face as individuals and households that market-based insurance isn't very good at dealing with. And then in terms of sort of the incentives and kind of helping to promote these positive sides of human nature, I think that the diversity of motivations that people have not been well represented in the way that these things have been talked about, right? And sort of the sort of rational actor model, right? It's like, yeah, people are selfish. And then they have like other models that they put on top, like, oh, well, some people, have other regarding preferences. And then, but that's them still being selfish because they're, making themselves feel good by doing things that help others, right? So like there's the way that the models, some of them have been constructed, end up just kind of like reifying this notion that people are fundamentally selfish because anything that is other regarding just gets put into the selfishness equation. And so I do think we need to rethink that and also acknowledge that there are really big individual differences in how people how much people value outcomes for themselves versus sort of being part of a community where everybody is thriving, or knowing that, well, hey, I might not have all of the resources in the world, but I'm in a community where everybody has what they need, right? Like there's people have different preferences about that. And another thing I'll just sort of throw in there, because I think this is super important, is there's a lot of sort of focus on, well, like, what am I getting for myself, or like the idea that people are in that mindset. But if you look at human behavior, a lot of times, what people are looking for is to be in a situation where they feel like they're contributing, not where they feel like they're extracting as much as possible. And I think that's been quite neglected, especially when it comes to like how that impacts us as professionals, right? Like, living in a world where we're working for, companies or institutions and making money or not making that much money, or feeling like we're doing good versus not knowing what we're doing, or, like all of those things I think are extremely important. And I feel like we're kind of at a moment now, like a bit of a reckoning, where people are like, yeah, all of these things are actually important to me and to other people. And how come it's not part of how the system is working?
I love this. And we have some hands up. I just wanted to offer two thoughts. One is that based on my readings, this whole idea of like the care-based equality and the proportion-based equity seem to develop in children naturally. So it seems like at around age 3, there have been all these experiments, and you will know way more about this than myself, where, I don't know, they would bring 7 marshmallows to 8 kids, and the 8th kid doesn't get a marshmallow, and then the 7 other kids are kind of pissed off, like, why didn't little Charlie get a marshmallow? But like at age 8, this proportionate equity instinct seems to develop, where I don't know, they give a chore to 7 out of the 8 kids to, I don't know, wash up the floor. And then they bring out the marshmallow as a reward and they give it to all the 8 kids. And now the 7 kids are pissed off. Like, why is Charlie getting a marshmallow? He didn't do anything. And you're like, oh my God, like the future kind of political leanings are there. It's just then it depends which one will be emphasized. And to go back to capitalism, I mean, I think far more than seeing ourselves as selfish people or selfish agents, I think in a lot of the economic thought that today's worldview is based upon, or world order is based upon, it's more about like whether we are rational agents or not. And basically, if you're a rational agent, and I'm kind of like leaning toward that idea, it's more about like, okay, you have self-interest and you have common interest. And if you have adequate amount of information and agency in the world, you will able to choose when you need to be selfish because you are, for instance, you are being exploited. Like selfishness stops the other person from exploiting you because you're like, stop. That's really important. Like otherwise we would not be able to give people freedom. And when is it when you have to stop being selfish because it's not benefiting you, it's not benefiting the community, and it's not helping you achieve your goal. And I always think like, is it incentives, is it information in those moments when people seem to not be able to choose well?
Yeah, and it can be both, I mean, if you don't have the information about how your, potential options will actually affect you and others, then it doesn't really, then you can't even act on the incentives, right? If you don't really know what's there. And I think that like really fundamentally we're a lot more interdependent than oftentimes we're sort of put into situations where things aren't framed that way, or we're kind of um, placed in situations where there is a zero sum situation, right? Only one person can be the winner of the cheerleading competition or whatever, right? Like there's situations where it is like you're sort of setting things up competitively. And I think keeping sight on the fact that a lot of times as humans, like we set up competitions actually as play to help us all do better, and keeping that frame as opposed to sort of overly taking seriously competition. Not that you shouldn't take it seriously as an opportunity to excel, but it's a form of play. It's a situation that oftentimes that we humans are setting up in order to sort of temporarily, ideally, pit ourselves against each other to just try to be the best we can be.
I want to give the mic to Laura, but before we log off this call, I will have to ask you whether you think video games are helping us learn this stuff better, by creating little simulations. Laura, do you want to take the floor? Thanks for your patience.
Yeah, I wanted to mention this, especially for like pessimists and stuff like that. We often like focus on, like, for example, with the election of Trump, or if you take a look at like Kim Jong-un or Netanyahu or Putin or whatever, all this bullshit. We focus on a lot of negative stuff. And when you take a look at history, you look at like, I don't know, Adolf Hitler and Mao and Napoleon. But like we have people like this. There are like people who are like the opposite of fucking Hitler, who are at the top of the political system. And for example, this guy, there's this expression, and it's not Dutch, but it's said about the Dutch, especially also coming back about our water management. Like God created the earth, but the Dutch invented the Netherlands. Like that's
I
this
love
guy.
it so much. That is so funny.
Yeah, like that was this guy, because like there was a lot of like in the Netherlands is a little bit like New York. I mean, New York came out of the Netherlands, right? And it's like a melting pot of all kinds of communities and cultures and all that kind of stuff. Mostly because of our port and our trade. And there was a lot of uncertainty. I don't even know when this was, like 1800, mid 1800s. And like we have all these people who don't fit together, and this guy is just like, well, you guys love to quabble and like do stupid stuff. Like, let's make more the Netherlands. Let's just build more land, you know. And we actually did that. And he was just like a political leader and an engineer. And the Dutch always managed to engineer their way out of problems, and even problems that kind of don't make sense. And it wouldn't surprise me if the Netherlands would be the first country to like invent Atlantis or something like 200 years from now.
Because you have to, right? Like the countries
Yes,
where, I
we
mean,
have
this is
to.
kind of the Mediterranean curse. Like if like the Antibes are not going to innovate, like they're fine. You just like you just want to hang out on the beach and you're in heaven. You don't want to go to heaven. You are already in heaven. Everybody else, we have to work. I mean, the Netherlands had to work to manage the water because first of all, it's fertile land, trade, great. But you have like a country based on having to solve something will be very smart.
Yeah.
I have to share with you guys. So, did I mentioned about my alternative book tour, right? And we had this sort of comedy stuff, and I'm also like writing music. And the newest song that I just wrote for this is called "Life Ain't a Prison, It's a Pie." And it's basically a way of like talking about all this sort of like game theory stuff and, sort of getting away from a negative framing and instead thinking about a positive framing and, making the pie bigger or building the Netherlands, right? So, and the chorus is life ain't a prison, it's a pie. If we all bring what we got, that pie's gonna be a lot. Life ain't a prison, it's a pie. And then, there's various verses, one that actually talks about like restorative justice and like walk away stuff, but it's in the context, it's like it's all just like fun and like a bluegrassy kind of song where everything is just like in the language of like being in the kitchen playing music and like getting out of a bad relationship, which are tropes that like happen in bluegrass. But the whole point is like to talk about this very issue that that if we frame things as like, well, what can we bring to the table to do, to create, and that can be really fun if you're doing it together and you have this sense of like we're making something that we all can benefit from. And oftentimes people are not in a mindset of like, oh, am I going to get exploited? Because they're just having fun, like imagining what could be and then doing that thing. And there's this, energy to like put a lot of effort towards things oftentimes if you're in that kind of creative zone, as opposed to being in a, very like like a work zone. When you're sort of having fun and being imaginative, it changes the way that we put effort towards things.
I love this so much. Misalo, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, that's exactly, I think, the kind of thing that I'm thinking about. Because I've been listening to a lot of Ray of Light, the Madonna album.
Hmm.
And like when I think about that album in comparison to, I feel like the weird bouts of pessimism that you get in more modern music, like I think something has happened to art and the way people are approaching making music, where everybody's kind of thinking about um an album of the year and sales versus they just discovered yoga and they want to make music completely inspired by that. And yeah, I feel like it makes you kind of worried about the apocalypse because it seems like our focus is just like completely on the wrong things if we're thinking about who has more money and kind of car when we should be thinking about like something else, you know?
Yeah.
I love that. I think that
Moral
art
degradation.
is so important and for so many reasons that it's just completely like the way that the economy works right now is just like so de-incentivizes being creative because it's so hard to succeed. And like the mythology that a lot of us inherit, okay, the mythology that I inherited coming from an immigrant background was you shouldn't make art. It's not practical. You're gonna starve and
Yeah.
die. But like,
Yeah.
I just don't think like I think world building, like cooperation, having fun, accessing that like creative state of mind in which people actually work harder and put more effort into things because they feel like they're building something and it's like
Mhm.
it's work, but it's like
Mhm.
enjoyable and it's
Yeah.
like fulfilling. Like
It's
all
like
of those things, like
collective flow. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
It like, and having fun
Mhm.
is like such an important element of that.
Yeah.
All of those things are like rooted in this like lived experience of like artistic practice, creative practice. Also, like building a connection to art is just like a natural way to facilitate like a feeling of connection and closeness to other people because that's what
Mhm.
it's like someone else's creation that makes you feel more like connected to like the collective as a whole and you're like wow like yeah I just think it's so important. I'm very passionate about this subject.
Yeah.
I love there was a piece by John Gans about the election, and he basically argued, which I really enjoyed, that one of the reasons why the Democrats had lost is because they optimized for this kind of corporate speak, like HR, corporate behavior, values, clothes, and they kind of forgot that in the pandemic that world has disappeared. Like nobody
Mhm.
wants to go and work in a midtown tower from 8 a.m. until 10 p.m., you know, in a super AC'd freezer in very tight, uncomfortable clothes that kill your like circulatory system. And whilst a million people are having phone calls around you and you can never ever pay attention. Like that's not how people want, like we want to do deep dives, right? And I just love that. I never thought about that. That it just, but basically the 20th, like Peter Thiel argued, right, that the 20th century was over with COVID. It's COVID that killed off the 20th century because the way we organize a society and thought would cooperate or thought how our hierarchies work, that's not true anymore. I mean, Interact was kind of ahead of its time in a sense where we were like, how the intellectual elite works in the West makes no sense. Like those are not the actual good ideas. Actual good ideas come out of conversation and not TED Talks. Nothing wrong with TED Talks, but like how many of the TED Talks would survive a conversation like this, where the author actually sits down and, you know, the audience asks questions and it's like a dialogue, right? Most, but not all of them. And to me, that's just like, that makes so much more sense somehow.
Mhm.
To go back to the resilience and the improv, and that you can't have rigidity anymore in the world
Mhm.
because people see rigidity and they either reject it or they are like, bring it closer, let me look at it. I have a lot of questions.
Mhm.
Nobody will take it at face value anymore. They
Yeah.
are like, what would Joe Rogan ask this guy, you know?
Mhm.
I want to ask a little bit about the nature of disasters that people are responding to, because one of the things that really struck me was, and COVID was a very interesting kind of mixed scenario. So you talk a lot about and beautifully about how to deal with the stress of an apocalyptic event, right? At the beginning, maybe you have the fear, and then you have this like super dynamic emotional response, and you have a lot of energy, but there is chronic stress. I don't know if you guys remember that during the pandemic, when we were under lockdown, we had weird stress symptoms after a few months because even if you can, like on the cognitive level, you can convince yourself that everything is fine and at least I can watch all of the Game of Thrones, your body is like, oh fuck, what's happening? We've been kidnapped by the other tribe and we are being held captive. And so like I remember forgetting things, or that I couldn't learn new names for a little bit. I dropped things all the time, which I don't normally do. Like things would fall out of my hands. And I was like, oh, like because my body is in this like semblance of normalcy, but like the animal is very wise, right? The animal always knows what's up. And so I'm just curious whether you feel that our stress response and how we organize, how we cooperate, is that different when it's a natural disaster versus a man-made one? And I'm asking this because COVID was kind of, I mean, first of all, we don't know, right? But it was, even if you just look at the transmissions, it's a kind of combination. How should we think about that?
I think, maybe the more sort of useful distinction is between like a shorter term versus a more chronic, right? And because, we do know that for in an immediate disaster situation, for a week or two afterwards, especially if it's been something serious, people are ready to mobilize to help, to rebuild. There's a sort of, dropping of like, should I do this or shouldn't I do this? And everybody kind of just like jumps in. But once things become chronic challenges, then that puts a strain on people's ability to just always sort of be in that helping mode. Um, One of the things that we saw in this longitudinal study that we did, though, is that if people felt interdependent with those around them, that they were able to sort of maintain a higher level of helping. Like it went down for everyone, but it went down less for people who had that feeling of interdependence. And so, I think there's something about like, how do we assess sort of the nature of our social environment? Are we in a place where other people have a stake in our well-being? We have a stake in their well-being. Like those things I think can really help to support us in being able to continue to help others and be in the sort of state that we would want to be. And I don't think we specifically looked at whether people's stress was lower as a result of that, but we do know that when people feel more supported, that they have less stress often, right? So probably, all of these things kind of work together so that if you're more embedded in a community, there's more resilience to dealing with those longer term chronic challenges.
And we know it today that, for instance, religious people, and we talked earlier about group evolution and group selection, right? That groups that are more cooperative with each other will just survive as a group more, and eventually all the participants benefit. And religion was like an early conductor of widespread cooperation, right? Because then you have the law, and you can justify why this law should be followed. And to this day, we have some findings to suggest that people who are religious tend to be happier and more relaxed, right? Which was really, really interesting to me. Laura, you have your hand up again. We can go there. And by the way, as we are talking, I keep thinking about the book Station 11, which I love so much, and shows you just how far we can go to rebuild even from zero together. If you haven't read this book yet, guys,
it's wonderful. It was a lot of inspiration actually for the Apocalypse Roadshow. So
really, oh my God. I mean, I love her. Yeah, Station 11. I love it so much that I refuse to watch the TV series because it's in my heart. I don't want to see it. Laura, you have your hand up, but then you left. Anyway, so we have like 4 minutes left, and I would love to talk a little bit as a kind of takeaway for the participants and for myself and for anyone who watches the video later on. You talk about the big one, and through that you explore basic prepping. So I don't want to let people go from the salon before getting a little bit of a grocery list of what to buy, what to think of acquiring the first day if something happens, because some stuff you can't store at home because, for instance, you live in New York City and there is no space. So what is the big one, and how should we start prepping? And can the Human Generosity Project be also on our to-do list as we wrap up this beautiful conversation?
Well, let me give you guys the link here that has all of the information about what you should have in your various kits. So that so you can just open that up, and if you just scroll down a little bit, there's diagrams that are from the figures from the book that have all of the kits in them. I think the most important thing is to have a shelter in place kit, and that's something that you should have now not something that you should try to put together in the event of a disaster. So a shelter in
Sorry to
place.
interrupt. I will put the link in the video, like in the YouTube description. This link will be there, okay?
Great, great. So this is essential because a disaster could happen with no warning. You want to have what you need to survive for 72 hours in your apartment or house or wherever you are. That includes water, at least 1 liter per person per day, food, any medicines that you would need, and some methods for communication. So like, radio, for example. And there's a lot of other items, that it would be good to have in there, but those are sort of the essential things because you want to make sure that you have enough water, especially because if the water supply gets interrupted, very, very quickly there'll be a humanitarian crisis because people won't have water. So make sure that you have extra water stored in your house. Start with that.
Don't I endanger myself if I'm the only person who has the water? That's my worry. Like if I'm the only person in this block who has this stuff and other people find out, what happens then?
Well, so this is all sort of part of like kind of creating a culture and community of preparedness. So, it is true that, if you're the only person who has resources and nobody else does, then other people might want your resources. So you'd have to think, well, what would I do? Would I share them? Do I have a friend who would, who lives nearby? Do I have people I trust who live nearby already? Right. So even just starting with this gets you then thinking about like how do you build that community? Because really having community is essential. Now what you do see though is like in disasters, people who have supplies often will share them with those who don't have them. And because most people are approaching that, these situations in that way, you might realize you don't have something that you need, somebody else does. And it's not necessarily like a strict reciprocity, but there is a sort of, people sort of coming to the table ready to help. So one of the other reasons to be ready with, your shelter in place kit or like, my car kit, I use that all the time, is because then you're in a position to help others too. I have a everyday carry kit, like for if I go, kayaking, hiking, out into the wilderness. And very often I end up using things from that to help people who I'm with or people who I might encounter who are in need. So even just being prepared does give you the opportunity to help others in times of need. And, that doesn't mean that that there might never be a situation where somebody takes some of your resources, like they might, but really the worst that could happen is that, somebody might say, give that to me. And then you'd be like, oh, okay, I guess you have a gun and I don't, so here you go, right? Like, but if that's the worst,
you need a gun. I mean, a good prepper has some crazy ass weapons, right?
well, so I would say that, having some method of protecting yourself, it doesn't have to be a gun. It doesn't even have to be a weapon, right? There are many ways to protect yourself. And being part of a trusted network, having a community is really important. So, I kind of take a very open-ended approach with guns. So I have some guns myself, but I'm not like I wouldn't say I'm a gun person. And I think that like really just if you have a gun, make sure that you lock it up to keep it safe because they can harm others, especially young people who don't understand them. So I think that that's really important. But I think that even more important is just to understand that like, if we approach even a disaster situation with a mindset of being under threat, that can actually spiral to create threat where there might not be threat. And so sort of just being ready to prepare to have the resources that you need to take care of yourself, to have enough to share with others too, if other people might need something. That's the best way for both yourself and to help build a positive community. Because, when the shit hits the fan, the last thing that we need is to be spending time and energy and resources on trying to protect what we have from others that we feel are threatening that. We really need to be able to just sort of go into a mode of like, figuring out how do we take care of our own needs, how are we able to help others who are more vulnerable, and just, have those networks really thrive rather than going into that sort of conflict-based mindset.
I completely agree, and like in a functioning mini, makeshift society, there would be guards kind of in a kind of cyclical way who take care of everybody. So not everybody carries arms, right? Like somebody protects the group and then the group is safe. Is there like, do you have a favorite place in the US where you would like the apocalypse to happen to you? Like how Balaji moved to Singapore. I don't know why it's moving closer to North Korea. It feels safer in a nuclear fallout. What is your go-to place?
So where would I want to be in the apocalypse?
Where would you, or where you want to go to if you have to? Yeah.
Question is so fucking funny.
What's that, Laura?
That question is so fucking funny.
I mean, I have some ideas on this. Like, you don't want to be.
Why? Why do you think it's funny?
Because it's so goddamn absurd.
Well, so I was gonna say, like, the idea that we'd be able to get to a particular place when the apocalypse happens, to be able to experience it there, not that likely. So my whole approach is like to be ready where I am, right? And so that means like being in a mindset of, having my preparations, like in whatever place I am, building community wherever I am, and being sort of, ready to adapt wherever I am. There's definitely places I'd rather not be. I definitely don't want to be in an airport. That sounds like that would be horrible. I hate being in airports, like in general. But I think, yeah, it really is a matter of like looking at your life as, well, how do I want to manage risk in general in my life? What kind of existence do I want to have in my home, whatever kind of home that is, in my workplace, whatever kind of workplace that is, and in my recreational life, whatever that happens to be.
I love this. And I think there's a beautiful metaphor in there, whether the apocalypse comes in our lifetime or not. Because we all, like Laura, you mentioned, like Lilia, you alluded to, we are all dealing with a variety of crises in our lives. And oftentimes they call us to arms a little bit. Like, this is a crisis and the world has changed. You have to deal with the change and, find your trusted network, ensure that you are safe, and let's deal with the changed world. To me, that's a beautiful takeaway. Athena Aktipis, thank you so much for being here. Congratulations on your new book, A Field Guide to the Apocalypse. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I had no idea this would be so practical. So now I'm going to Amazon and buy things. I hope you're getting a commission along with your book. This is an absolute joy. And I just love this intersection of like sci-fi, society, psychology, and econ, or behavioral science. It's just such a much needed thing. And I hope that everybody who watched this will now go and buy the book. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. And
thank you.
And it would be amazing if you do, end up reading the book, if you could put a review on Amazon or Goodreads, because like I have all these like great reviews like Washington Post and whatever, but then there's like hardly any things on Amazon.
We'll do that. Absolutely.
That would be amazing.
Oh, I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that and for sharing your knowledge, and best of luck with all the prep, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks for coming.